died between the age of 25 and 35, which correspond to the idea that Nefertiti married Akhenaten in her teens, served as great royal wife for most of his 17-year reign, became King Nefer-Neferuaten shortly before Akhenaten's death, and ruled for 3 years before her violent end. For Nefer-Neferuaten's murder is that her efforts to steer a middle path between the Amun and the Amun cults did not satisfy the conservatives who worked to see a wholesale restoration of the old religion. Alternatively, she could have been killed by extremist Artemists who believed that her moderation was a betrayal of Akhenaten's legacy. Although Nefer-Neferuaten, Nefertiti's father, would become Tutankhamun's government following that, this does not necessarily mean that he was responsible for instigating the murder of his daughter. Zahi Hawass rejects the identification of the younger lady with Nefertiti and instead argues that the two unidentified bodies from two caving kings, Nefertiti and her daughter Ankhesenaut, is unaccounted for. The bodies are in a poor state of preservation, with many missing parts, making it difficult to analyze their remains and properly identify them. Nefer-Neferuaten's death left Tutankhamun as the sole king. Again, the chronology of these events is far from certain, but Nefertiti's death appears to have occurred around 1330 BC, by which time Tutankhamun was around 11. His government was dominated by Nefertiti's father, who would himself become king after the boy's death. Regent was Horemheb, a general who would succeed Eye and may have married Nefertiti's sister, Nechert, to legitimize his rule. The two men were responsible for decisively moving away from Artemism, and the young king and queen took the names Tutankhamun and Ankhesenaut to symbolize the restoration of the old religion. Indeed, they meant reaction against the heresy Akhenaten and Nefertiti were judged to have dismantled, and the images of Akhenaten and Nefertiti in the distinctive Amarna style were chipped away at and repurposed for the construction of temples dedicated to Tutankhamun. Thebes was re-established as the capital. The gradual abandonment of Amarna meant removing the bodies from royal tombs at Amarna to Thebes, while the bodies of Akhenaten, Smenkhare, and Tiye were moved to KV-55. The three young princesses, Menkaure, Nefer-Neferure, and Selimpenre, remain unaccounted for. The remains of Nefer-Neferuaten may have also initially been placed in an unidentified tomb. Alternatively, if she is the younger lady, then Nefertiti may have been buried in KV-55 before being moved to KV. That Tutankhamun's famous tomb, KV-62, was initially a simple tomb where Nefertiti was buried. Then, when Tutankhamun died at a extremely young age, the tomb was extended and decorated for the king, while Nefertiti's mummy was moved into KV-35. A further rearrangement of the Amarna bodies may have taken place at this time. As Akhenaten and Tiye were removed, the former's body may have been destroyed by fire, while the latter joined Nefertiti in KV-35. Smenkhare was left inside the tomb, with his names erased from his coffin. After the death of Tutankhamun, possibly from a hunting accident, his successors embarked on a wholesale campaign to erase Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun, and the cult of Aten, which they were so firmly associated with, from history. While this process was initiated by Eye, after his brief reign, his name was also excised from history by Horemheb, who would rule for a decade and a half as the final king of the 18th dynasty. In the official official lists of Egyptian kings from the temples of the 19th dynasty kings, Seti I and Ramses II. Horemheb is shown as Amenhotep III's direct successor with a reign of over 30 years. Despite these efforts, when the Egyptian priest and historian Manetho compiled a major list of Egyptian kings or pharaohs in the 3rd century BC, by which time Egypt was under Greek rule, he gave the names of the 5 kings that may correspond to the rulers of the Amarna period. 3 of these are named Akencheres, which might refer to Akhenaten, or the 2 kings named Ankeperure. The Akencheres at the beginning of the list is identified as a woman, indicating that even after 1,000 years after Horemheb's efforts to raise the names, records of the Amarna kings in Christianity and the suppression of the traditional pagan cults in Egypt at the end of the 4th century AD meant that knowledge of the Egyptian hieroglyphics was lost, until the Rosetta Stone was deciphered in the early 19th knowledge of Egypt kings as represented in hieroglyph for the kings of the late dynasty by the during this period, scholars also the unusual elements before scholars Others could read texts. As the great royal wife of Bach with the discovery of primitive correspondence. These shared much further noted similarities with Court Tesla was the bust of where the finds were transported the bust to Cairo. It was given to the bust was in Berlin the second with a copy of it art in Phoenix, the outlet to Germany for some and Egyptian explorer in the life art by the telephone between the prevailing and it was only denied and a transducer display into public and the public exhibition of the head of the Egyptian authorities. To exchange the bust with Hungary proposed returning the bust shortly after remaining in Berlin for most of the war. It was taken to assault in the Church of Berlin. There the bust was recovered by the army. The American authorities refused to repatriate the artifact to Egypt, arguing that it was still under German headship, since the Moyes Museum was badly damaged during the Second World War. The bust and other Egyptian artifacts were deposited at several locations around Berlin until 2009, when it was returned to the restored museum. Since return to public display has inspired further calls from Egyptian authorities for its return to Egypt and display as a major centerpiece of the newly opened Grand Egyptian Museum. Like Tutankhamun, Nefertiti has defied the efforts of the post-Omar to consign her into oblivion, and has it of interest in her, of her life, in patching, and any coherent narrative of her life relies on making a series of assumptions that might be proven false by new evidence. Nefertiti was seemingly the daughter of Ai and the unnamed sister of Amenhotep III. She married Amenhotep IV mature Argonaut in her mid-teens. The coming fall of her husband's reign, which started around the very middle of the 14th century BC, the royal court and household moved to Akhenaten, and Menhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, and Nefertiti added Nefer-Neferuat to her name as they began reorientating the state religion towards the worship of the sun disk. While Akhenaten and Nefertiti exclusively worshipped the art, the cults of the other gods didn't play until in around the 9th year of Akhenaten's reign. In year 12, shortly after the great celebration to mark the completion of the city of Akhenaten, a plague claimed the lives of 3 young princesses and the queen mother Tiye. This prompted Akhenaten to make his younger brother, Smenkare, a regent, anticipating that he could protect the young Tutankhamun and protect the Artemis religion that he was trying to establish throughout Egypt. When Smenkare died shortly thereafter, Akhenaten gave Nefertiti a kingly crown. Then she was not made a full king until very shortly before Akhenaten's death. As king, Ankheperure Nefer-Neferuat put a policy of religious moderation and revived the cult of Amun. She reigned for 3 years as king until dying violently during a political upheaval. I and Horemheb assumed the reins of government on behalf of the young king, now called Tutankhamun. Nefertiti's remains items of whether she is anonymous with the younger lady and whether or not she was the mother of Tutankhamun remains a major point of scholarly debate. Continuing the examination of the various royal tombs and the mummies within them from the 14th century BC, using ever-evolving scientific consequences, and perhaps scholars reach consensus is derived from the Greek word kleos, meaning glory, and pater, meaning father, so her name effectively meant glory to her father. It was a common name within her family, and many Egyptian queens in the century and a quarter before her birth were also called Cleopatra. Her father was Ptolemy is in a few fragmentary records of Cleopatra. Certain siblings came, our two brothers, both of them Ptolemy, like their father, a name that virtually every male member of the royal family historians. Whether these brothers and sisters were full siblings or half siblings of Cleopatra's is unknown, though we can say that Ptolemy XII was definitely their father in each instance. Cleopatra was born 2.5 centuries into the inception of Ptolemaic rule in Egypt. The Ptolemaic kingdom was one of the successor states to the empire that Alexander the Great had swiftly conquered and briefly ruled in the 4th century BC. Alexander had conquered Egypt from the Persian Empire in 331 BC and ordered the construction of a new city at the mouth of the river Delta, which he named Alexandria. He then left the country and headed beyond the years of the known world. His untimely death in 323 BC, at just 32 years of age, had opened up a succession crisis, as Alexander's only legitimate child was still in his mother's womb at the time, and there was no consensus as to who should rule in his stead until he came of age. A civil war consequently erupted amongst Alexander's generals and close companions for control of various parts of the empire. One of them was Ptolemy, a Macedonian general of considerable repute, who enjoyed support among some sections of the army. Over the next several years, in what will become known as the Wars of the Diadochi, or Crown Princes, Ptolemy established himself as ruler of Egypt, while several others secured control over other parts of the empire. Eventually, Alexander's child and heir, Alexander IV, was murdered in 309 BC. The Diadochi dropped the pretense of fighting to preserve the empire for Alexander's child and established their own kingdoms. Ptolemy became King Ptolemy I. In addition to Egypt, he secured control over parts of Libya, the island of Cyprus, and much of the Levant north along the coast towards Mauritania. The great rival of the Ptolemies here, which they would fight with in many wars, was the Seleucid Empire, which ruled from central Turkey east to Persia. The kingdom of Macedon controlled Greece itself. The Ptolemaic kingdom emerged in the 3rd century as the greatest of the Hellenistic kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean world, to result from Alexander's conquests. Alexandria was built into a magnificent city by Ptolemy and his successors, Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III, a great centre of learning, complete with the foremost library of the ancient world. Many of the most fundamental early breakthroughs in fields of mathematics, astronomy, geography, and science were made to the Seleucid Empire and to lose much of its smaller territory in the east to newly emergent powers like the Parthian Empire of Persia and Macedon's control of Greece, fragmented as new alliances, city-states emerged. The Ptolemaic managed the Roman Republic in central Italy, two decisive wars between the Sea. Cleopatra grew up in the most cultured city in the world, and she must have received a very good education. Leading scholars to his children's education. The sense of how dynamic the intellectual environment was here. Consider the hero, the Greek scholar conversation. Right around Cleopatra was, and many years later would develop a working steam in the city. Had the Roman world exploited this technological breakthrough, it would have led Cleopatra was believed to have been well enough educated that she was a medical texts during her youth. This story was later attested to by Arab scholars who might have had access which is now lost. Given how common the name Cleopatra's image is in the authorship of their Egyptian gods including Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, and perhaps others like Syriac and Ethiopian. Sometimes Cleopatra, although she would become one of the most famous female in the world, really written about historians and writers, There are detailed ancient depictions are several sculptures colored with small images. A side profile image of Cleopatra and she is in many other royal guises around the appearance. There is no real evidence of the Queen world by centuries, but they did so as a foreign dynasty, controlling the country from a Greek capital in the far north of Egypt. Moreover, the Ptolemies were known for inbreeding, with sisters even marrying brothers, as we will see, in order to secure the royal dynasty's control over Egypt without challenge. Admittedly, her matrimony not 100% it's from her clear that she had Hellenistic features Middle East and Mediterranean, and in particular, but then conquered the remnants of city the Eastern Mediterranean. Its status was complicated. The Romans had been interfering in the politics of the Ptolemaic kingdom for almost a century already by the time Cleopatra was born. When her father's predecessor, Ptolemy XI, had died in 80 BC, he had left behind no male heir, and the Romans had debated annexing Egypt for a time before Cleopatra's father became the new ruler. Still, the Romans had taken advantage of the situation to carve off Cyprus from the Ptolemaic dominions. They gave the island to another Ptolemy, an illegitimate brother of Ptolemy, who ruled the eastern Mediterranean island. Meanwhile, throughout the 60s BC, as Cleopatra was growing up in Egypt, the issue of potentially annexing Egypt, a region coveted for its agricultural abundance and the riches of Alexandria, was regularly discussed within Brennan's Senate, a sign of how precarious the independence of Cleopatra's empire was, and of her family's position as its ruler. The issue of Rome's influence in Egypt swirled around Cleopatra. protest against the rule of Cleopatra's father. For a while to Montreal and headed for the city. He came back on the journeys of danger for Rome if it intervened directly in Egypt's military and political affairs. What young Cleopatra must have made of all of this is uncertain. She was still a child of just 12 years. Presumably, her education continued in Rome, and we can imagine that it was during this year spent in the capital of the Republic that she Syria and allies to England came returned and paid the course of the corporals, placed in a stronger position as a military commander. The story was designated to BC, also stated in his and Cleopatra. He was either her full or half brother. As success I was a boy when her time followed long before married queen was one, reflecting her family's position. Egypt. She ascended in Arizona the northern city surrounded by a community, and Egyptian religious rites as Pharaoh of Egypt. This was the ancient capital of the Egyptian New Kingdom, back in the Bronze Age of the 2nd millennium BC, synonymous with modern-day Luxor. The ceremony here indicated the way that the Ptolemaic dynasty lived in Hellenistic rule and ancient Egyptian custom. The first years of Cleopatra's reign, her kingdom was in position of the River Nile. This was the ancestor to deposit rich alluvial soil all along the banks of the river for hundreds of kilometers. Because of the construction of the Assam Dam in the 20th century's reign, organized the East with a very large Roman army led by Marcus Crassus, led by the Empire of Mesopotamia and Persia, at the Battle of Carmel in June 53 BC. The Parthians were made incursions into Roman territories in the aftermath, leading to Roman calls for assistance from its Egypt. Most were also led to a powerful Roman military faction in the country. This was a force of 1,000 Roman legionaries and 500 cavalry, who had arrived as part of Aulus Gabinius' forces from the 12th rank. After remaining in Egypt, and adopted following the 13th as time went by, a development which made her position more difficult. Cleopatra into these issues. The inundation and the decline in agricultural inhabitants. Egypt was, along with the island of Sicily, a breadbasket of grain. With Egyptian grain being shipped to the masses of the rapidly expanding city. In dealing with her own country, to also try not to avoid the Romans, not dependent on Egyptian grain. It would take time to pay back Egypt, or it would become increasingly enormous. In 50 BC, when Roman emissaries arrived from Syria to try she responded in the conference to Syria to be tried for seeming to win in Roman affairs. She also her young brother with a child early in the reign indicates that she tried, and she appears on some royal script as the sole royal Muslim. Ptolemy XIII begins appearing as king on royal inscriptions again from 50 BC. A new civil war between Cleopatra and her young brother Each supporters within him. This was also which would impact Egypt and Cleopatra before long. Crassus's defeat by the Parthians at Carrhae in 53 BC brought to an end a political alliance that had existed in Rome since 60 BC, one known as the First Triumvirate. This had involved Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, a slightly younger rival of Pompey. This just one development in the process was and generals had started to become public after he had won previously against an opposing faction known as the Marians. Sulla had relinquished and died soon after in retirement. However, his actions would be undermined and taken over if a man were rejection. Gilgamesh emerged in a sea of blood. As news of Caesar's conquests arrived to Rome, Pompey is still able and presented him a number of the armies he had under his command. In response, Caesar led his legions south and famously crossed the river in the summer of 48 BC. Greece had met with Pompey's army at Phasaelus on the 9th of August, which ancient accounts portrayed as a formidable victory for Caesar, who was heavily outnumbered by the Pompeians. He managed to break Pompey's lines and rout them. Pompey's men were killed in camp. Pompey himself escaped to the island of Lesbos and considered his exploits. His corps in places like Hispania and North Africa will continue the fight. Cato the Younger, a prominent senator, had an army in the province of Africa around what is now Tunisia and intended to fight on against Caesar here. Taking stock of this, Pompey decided to sail for Egypt, where he hoped to acquire further support from the Ptolemaic dynasty and presumably link up with Cato's forces to make North Africa the centre of his cause. He would have assumed that he would receive support from Cleopatra, given the generous help he had provided her and her father. A decade earlier, when Ptolemy XII had come to Rome, arriving there in late September 48 BC. When he arrived to Cleopatra's homeland, he was killed immediately. A party of Roman mercenaries, led by Lucius, Septimius, military officer, his meteoric Eastern campaign, in which he had conquered in the sea. On his decision to head Egypt in the aftermath of the Battle of Phocis, which Cleopatra's life, within a few days of Pompey's death, it became apparent that Caesar was about to arrive himself to Egypt, having learned what his rival's plans were, and hoping to intercept Pompey's new Pompey's in Africa. When he arrived early when he came to Alexandria, he settled that his next moves. Find Pompey's death, Cato and others, including Pompey's son, Sextus Pompeius, would continue to fight on for many years. As he considered his options in the Egyptian capital to outflank her brother and claim power, while also preserving the independence of her native kingdom to some extent. She was outside of Alexandria at this time, and wished to meet with him. Then, beautified herself so as to appear before him in the most majestic and at the same time pity-inspiring guise. When she had perfected her scheme, she entered the city. It was known that Caesar, who was 52 to Calpurnia, had begun a relationship with her. The marrying of Caesar was doubly necessary, as the power struggle with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, which had been brewing for several years, had broken out into Ptolemy XIII was still very good, and Cleopatra's adversary in this was a court eunuch by the name of Pothinus, who had been regent for young Ptolemy since the accession in 51 BC, along the capital of Europe. There was the third faction emerging, with the claims of Cleopatra's other younger sister, Arsinoe, to the throne. Even as Caesar and Pompey were preparing their forces for the clash at Phocis, Cleopatra to briefly flee from Alexandria into the Levant. After gathering her supporters, she had returned to Egypt. Pompey and then Caesar had consequently arrived as the three-main royal family of Rome. Cleopatra's intervention with Caesar makes her notorious by ordering the execution of Pothinus and declared that Cleopatra in Egypt, Ptolemy XIII and Arsinoe then joined forces, a remarkable set of Caesar and in the winter of 48 BC, Arsinoe's cause was defeated. Currently, from the scene of his defeat, Arsinoe only survived because she was exiled and took sanctuary in the temple of Artemis there, killing her, which injured her great grandchildren. as a candidate had worked as aid. She had reclaimed her throne, challenged ruler Egypt once again. The issue of the problem in Egypt, and in order to shore up her position, Cleopatra installed her other, younger brother as her co-ruler in 47 BC, too confusingly called Ptolemy as well. Ptolemy XIV, as he now became, was the youngest member of the family and was only around 11 or 12. His exact birth. Also, Caesar had only had one child from his marriages, a daughter named Julia, who had died in 54 BC. An event which had celebrated the Republic. She had been married to one. The latter would have, even though he was the equestrian ruler of Rome by then, having claimed dictatorial powers. The child was named Caesar. By the time he was born, war instigated off from Egypt with her newborn child in 40 Rome. She spent the next 2 years living there. Was viewed poorly by many in the political council of the city. They perceived her as an grasping after. There were also a lot of reasons relationship with her and the possibility of him being a development like this would have been unthinkable amongst the Roman. But he was impervious to convention in his refusal to relinquish power. Caesar had club of dictatores at the start of the civil war against Pompey on the grounds that the military necessity to with the civil war people associated Cleopatra. She was on the Roman general. These included the Greek Cicero, who knew from Cicero's letter when also learned that Cleopatra might have become pregnant again while in Rome with one child of Caesar's. Though if she did, the Egyptian also lost her lover before the 15th of March, 41st of the Roman calendar. Caesar was stabbed to death by a cohort of senators in Rome who had decided he was intent by it and needed to be stopped. With his assassination, everything was in flux. After the murder of Cleopatra, only remained in Rome for long enough to have it confirmed that Caesarea had not been. Once this was clear, she left promptly. Her son would now have been a target for anyone seeking to succeed Caesar, as the preeminent figure in the crumbling Roman Republic. And consider the next steps. Ptolemy XIV. A royal inscription indicates that he was still alive in mid-July 44 BC. He died at some point over the next 8 or 9 weeks, as Caesarea was proclaimed as Cleopatra's September with the ring. Or dispensed with in some other way. Thus did Cleopatra bolster her position in Egypt immediately after Caesar's assassination and removed any possibility of Ptolemy XIV becoming the focus of renewed opposition to her rule within Egypt. The assassination of Caesar had set in motion new conflicts within the Roman Republic. The most prominent one was between the supporters of the murdered dictator and the faction of senators who had killed him. This is known as the Liberators. As soon as she was back in Egypt and had solidified her control over the throne, Cleopatra began receiving emissaries from both sides, allied in the civil war. Her was important because the war was beginning to focus on Greece and the eastern Mediterranean, where Cleopatra was now in control of the island of Cyprus. Caesar had given the island back to a family in 47 BC. After a brief period of just over a decade of rule of Cyprus, as well as a powerful fleet and a substantial army, for obvious reasons, her loyalties lay with those who were seeking to avenge Caesar's killing. And she, through her Arsinoe, allied with Serapion in 41 BC, while Arsinoe was murdered, where she had sought sanctuary years earlier, violation of religious sanctity. By then, the Liberators' War had come to an end. Caesar's killings defeated in 2 battles at Philippi in 42 BC, stated by and remained in Cyprus after. As the Liberators were away, the politics of the collapsing Roman Republic were shifting rapidly as Caesar's potential successors positioned as the rule of the state. 3 figures in particular were emerging as potential heirs. The first was Caesar's great nephew, Octavian, a young man who was only 18 years old, was naked, but who had been named by the dictator as his heir in his will. The others were Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, 2 long-standing allies of Caesar's, who had both served as magistrates before the assassination. A position formed a political alliance known as the Second Triumvirate in 43 BC. Through this, they aimed to share power within the Republic. marginalized. Antony married Octavian's sister. Antony had first fled east, all the way back in 55 BC, when he had been part of the Roman military intervention in Egypt and her father to power. The rule in Egypt of Egypt and its great resources also vital. If Antony was to manage to retain control over the east, it seems to have become a passionate affair. Children soon followed. Twins, a boy named Alexander Helios and a girl named Cleopatra Selene. Even was marrying Octave at that time, while the second son, Darphus, was born 4 years later, in 36 BC. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar had begun back in late after his defeat at Phos. Caesar would not have ended up there, but Cleopatra would not have been in a position to move. In Antony's case, her actions were possible far more premeditated. She a great campaign place against the backdrop of Antony, readying an army of tens of thousands of legionaries, and campaigning extensively against the Parthian Empire, trying constantly vying for the order in 36 BC, before returning to Egypt to give birth to their young. Also reigns between Octavian and Antony, and his relationship with Cleopatra, public nature of it, even as Antony's sister Octavia was Eastern Mediterranean, and was starting to raise influence with Antony. As Cleopatra and Antony became lovers, and then the main power aimed at the Roman Republic. All manner of stories began to attach themselves to him. It claimed that he had written a book exclusively on alcohol and drinking. This and many other stories were symbolic of the alleged debauchery and excess of their court in Athens. In which he presented a tale about Cleopatra with previous instructions. The servants placed in front of her only a single vessel containing quality which mouths was a sign of how that fanciful strike was still circulating a century later in spite of many painted from the 16th century. The story figures enough that Pliny can write military in and of itself. The tale is meant to highlight a growing sort of decadence and aloofness nothing to alleviate the concerns that many Roman states who had a lot of the Parthian Empire. The raid had been successful, and Antony returned to the city. They were meeting a trader as his captain. He now decided to hold a triumph, kind of thoughts would be. His decision to hold this portrait compounded the mystery that Antony now believes effectively ruling over an independent kingdom, one which can make matters worse. On the eve of the triumph, Cleopatra and Antony were an event known as the Donations of Alexandria. They and their own children together, the series of lavish royal titles. Caesarion was stated to be a new king of Egypt. Alexander Helios and Parthia. Cleopas was awarded the Lycilia donated to him and was named as king thereof. This was a striking statement of Cleopatra and Antony's ambitions to rule over the eastern Mediterranean in their own right. They were gift to Octavian. Was given Cleopatra and visitors to prostrate themselves on the ground in front of them, an act which the Romans viewed as being beneath their dignity. Now Antony seemed to have confirmed suspicions, even to the team himself with Cleopatra. Cleopatra featured in many of these criticisms many peoples who had moved on to his potential success as soon as he was killed. They took young daughters, of which Antony was the father. He added some in 30 when he finally married Cleopatra without his cause. He was aided by having illegally obtained a copy of Antony's will that had been deposited which amongst other provisions included an expressed desire actually to get Cleopatra and Egypt to rival that of Rome. Whether this was true and a strong block of this, many left Rome when the war broke out and went to join Antony's camp. It would be a short civil war, one in which has become known. This is because it all began. Cleopatra decided to head to Greece to begin building up their forces here for a potential strike against Italy and Rome. At the same time, leading military commander Marcus Agrippa moved to prepare a large fleet with which to attack Cleopatra's armies before they gained the initiative. As Octavian's forces moved toward Cleopatra and Antony decided to try and break out of the Gulf and split in one of the largest naval battles in history. Involving hundreds of ships. Cleopatra fled with the remaining ships and men back to Egypt. Their plans in disarray. The events which followed have taken on a season to operate in Egypt nearly 2 decades now, 30 BC. Despite having nearly a year to prepare for the assault on the country, lost. These had surrendered, and there was a shift in sentiment, with many former supporters of Antony and Cleopatra now changing sides to back Octavian. When Caesar's great nephew arrived to Egypt, his troops were tired from the long march, but aided It's a powerful story where Antony did not die immediately before Cleopatra, who was alive after all. Cleopatra was his troops he demanded that she would not be paraded. Decided to join her lover in death. The date is disputed. It probably occurred on the 10th of August, 30 BC, meaning that Cleopatra was only about 39 years of age. There are a number of varying accounts as to how she took her own life. The most famous one holds that her attendants thanks for her, and she then was bitten by an ass. However, the more plausible reality is he drank some poison. eating a fine last meal, and bathing before she did so. Numerous lavish theories have emerged in the centuries since about what might alternatively have happened. What could have had her discreetly amongst the most important is that she died of and she, which have never been found by archaeologists. Cleopatra's death and the defeat of her and his cause in the War of Actions over the previous quarter of a century. Egypt was subsumed into the Roman state, as was Cyprus. This was not as inevitable as it is. At this juncture, modern-day Bulgaria and other regions continued to be ruled as client states until well into the 1st century AD, even though the Romans could have annexed them quite easily decades earlier. In Egypt's case, but wiped out. Historians believe this may have been owing to illness rather than foul play. Cleopatra Seville went on to marry King Juba II of Mauritania. What this was that Egypt was annexed directly to the Roman state, which Octavian became the first of Augustus. Changes in 2005 to the empire, one which acted as a bread delivering huge shipments of grain and upwards the second largest city of the empire for centuries to come, scientific and intellectual hub of the Greek East. If one wanted to learn about mathematics or medicine in the Roman Empire, then one went to study Rome's entry to the Red Sea and the emergence of a thriving trade into the Indian Ocean. Within a few of the death of Cleopatra and the entire of Egypt, Romans trade finance has become two millennia with much of it has to do with our relationship and Greek and Roman historians. Interested in ancient She featured that Libby's transfers films appears in the system as a result, although it generally received favourable reviews. Cleopatra was unquestionably amongst the most famous women of the 50 writers times, with many historians discussing her down to the end of the Roman Empire. For centuries, using its independence. Cleopatra's life was framed around attempting to maintain Egypt's and her own family's position. To that end, Julius Caesar as her lover, and had children with both men. There was an element of doubt with this. Cleopatra might have been calculated in her actions, entirely beyond her control. 48 BC, Pompey the Great would choose to flee to Egypt. If he had gone, Caesar had not ended up in Cleopatra's homeland and pursued him. Once she caught his eye and began to chip with him, her ambitions increased. It is very plausible that she imagined that if Caesar lived long enough as a successor one day, when he was assassinated, the ship with him was based on genuine devotion. Yet there is no doubting that she also benefited from it politically. The donations of Alexandria of 34 BC and the lavish titles bestowed on her children point towards the her ambition. However, decided to take her life. What do you think of Cleopatra? Was it possible that she genuinely relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony? Or did she utilize to supply a degree of genuinely speaks? Let us tackle. While Alexander's and relatives fight over his crumbling empire, one of those commanders, however, does not see an end, but a beginning, and after being made governor of Egypt, eventually proclaims himself Pharaoh, founding a Hellenic dynasty that will rule Egypt for 300 years, ending with the life and reign of Queen Cleopatra. The man's name, Ptolemy the first pharaoh of Ptolemaic Egypt. The man known to history as King Ptolemy I, Soter of Egypt, was most likely born in 367 BC. We have no clear of his birth, but an ancient source called Macrobiite century AD writer Lucian of Samosata claims that Ptolemy was 84 years old when he died in 283, which would be born around he was as power in the Greek world at the time of his birth. Ptolemy's father was most likely a Macedonian named Lagus, who came from an undistinguished family. There is another theory concerning Ptolemy's 2nd century AD. Pausanias, writing in his description of Greece a travelogue of War's history and law, refers to a tradition which indicates that Ptolemy's father was not Largus, but it was instead King Philip II, who rose to become ruler of Don 39 BC. According to Cicero, Ptolemy's mother, she married Largus and the Great, and therefore Alexander probably invented by Ptolemy, which later in his Alexander, after the latter's premature death. Had Ptolemy really been Alexander's father, the latter would almost certainly be a dynastic rival and a threat to Alexander might well have had him murdered. Rather than promoting him, Ptolemy became one of Alexander's friends and advisors. Ptolemy is known to have had a brother named Menelaus, who served as a general in Cyprus and later as a priest to the cult of Alexander in Alexandria. But no other recipients. At the time, the kingdom and the powers of the Greek dynasty had parts of what is now northern Greece and North Macedonia, so the cities differently too, often relying on cavalry divisions in their wars. Unlike the infantry soldiers, diffused north, and became had triumphed over Athens in the Peloponnesian War, a power struggle for hegemony over the Greek world that lasted 27 years. Dominance over the Greek city-states came to an end in 371 BC, when their armies were defeated by the Boeotian League, led by Thebes. At the Battle of Leuctra, when a professional army and adopting new tactics, he developed the formidable Macedonian phalanx, consisting of rows of men of the king, which often proved afterwards the Olympians and the Boeotian League as the dominant power in central Greece. This was the political and military backdrop against which Ptolemy, like other Macedonians, learned how to ride and hunt, writing being Ptolemy, king of the kingdom of Macedon. It was certainly not as cultivated a place as Athens or Corinth. Macedonians were known for their heavy and many of their customs and traditions appalled the rest of the Greek world, particularly that of polygamy, as Macedonian kings married multiple wives to strengthen alliances at home and abroad. Although the Macedonians spoke Greek, they were called barbarians, perhaps the south. Ptolemy would have continued his training in the military arts, and by the time of his late teens, may have served in the army during Philip's campaigns of conquest. At Athens, to come to Pella and tutor him studying with Aristotle alongside the Macedonian prince. Learning and scholarship would be a part of Ptolemy's legacy as king of Egypt. Aristotle's arrival, pausing here to assess exactly how we know anything about Ptolemy and where the gaps in knowledge lie. For the first half of the death of Alexander the Great, when Ptolemy was in his early to mid-40s, is the Anabasis of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great and his campaign in Asia and India, written by Arrian of Nicomedia, a Greek historian of the 2nd century AD. Anabasis is an ancient Greek name. Ptolemy necessarily. In his later life, Ptolemy became a historian himself, though unfortunately, virtually everything he wrote has been lost. Surviving second-hand writings of later scholars like Arrian, Eastern Mediterranean, wrote the death of Alexander and the fragmentation of his empire. Ptolemy appears regularly in this biography. Both composed universal histories of the world, in which the conquests of Alexander and the wars fought by the rulers of the Hellenistic kingdoms, which followed them. Again, Ptolemy and his famed events there, some incidentally so. For instance, century BC letter of Aristeas to Philocrates provides one of the most in Alexandria, the capital of Ptolemy's kingdom, emerged as a great center of learning in the 3rd century BC. The ruler who reigned for the better part of 40 years in ancient times. There are many inscriptions on buildings and other archaeological sources which can shed light on Ptolemy's reign. So when he was a young man, Ptolemy began his ascent through the ranks of the Macedonian army in 339 BC.
demonstration of a Theban resistance. Ptolemy may have been one of the officers at his side. Alexander led the breakthrough against the Sacred 100-man elite Theban infantry unit. The following year, Philip summoned the Greek states to Corinth and forced them to swear oaths to each other and him, establishing himself as the hegemon of the Greek world. In 3, he temporarily lost his court position. At that time, Alexander planned to marry the daughter of the satrap or Cacaria in what is now southwestern Turkey. Ptolemy was among 5 of Alexander's advisors who supported the offer against the king's wishes. The furious King Philip responded those involved from Pella. It is unclear where Ptolemy and his comrades went, but they may have been back in the capital by the time Philip was assassinated. One of his bodyguards, 36 BC, the circumstance death. 20-year-old Alexander became King Alexander III of Macedon. His military exploits would soon earn him the epitaph Alexander the Great. The young king almost immediately faced a rebellion from the southern Greeks. But he quickly defeated these opponents and re-established in 335 BC, while conceptual rivals, Alexander led campaigns against the Triballi and the Illyrians received news that the Thebes had once again revolted. He thus marched south with a force of 30,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. Again transmitted via Arian. The Macedonians took the city with heavy casualties after the general without awaiting orders from Alexander, and like us, the civil wars that ensued following the death of Alexander. Alexander brutally ordered the city to be razed to the ground. It would not be rebuilt for another 2 decades. Alexander then turned his attention towards the invasion of Asia, which his father, after leaving Greece in the hands of cavalry and sailed across the Bosporus to Asia, he then united his forces with 10,000 men under the Macedonian general Parmenion, who had been in Asia Minor since 336. The Macedonian forces there for the coming campaign. Ptolemy served with the army, but his precise rank and role is unknown. And king's other Persian name for what we know as Turkey today had been ruled by a vast realm ruled by the Persians, a group who had emerged out of Iran or Persia in the 550s BC and rapidly conquered most of their empires and region here, the Caucasus, and even into parts of Central Asia, Iran and Pakistan, area then known as Bactria. The Persians even tried to conquer main Greece, but were famously repulsed during two attempts in the early 5th century. After 2 centuries of rivalry between the Greeks and the Persians, masters of power, the states, making Persia. Alexander consequently embarked in 330 on a campaign or anabasis, as Arrian would call it, to conquer tribes or governors, minor kings who ruled the provinces of the Persian Empire on behalf of Darius III, the Persian king of kings, who had just succeeded to the throne far away in the Persian capitals, Sus and Persepolis in southern Iran. In the Bosporus, Alexander's army was confronted by an army raised by the local Persian satrap in phalanxes, easily overwhelmed the lightly armed Persians, alarmed King Darius III, who began to raise a large army in Mesopotamia. To meet the Macedonian threat, clashed at Issus in southern Turkey in November 333 BC. While an army of 1 million men, though modern estimates are figuring closer to 100 men. Again, while Ptolemy left a detailed description of any men under his command, knowing he could not engage the enemy in a conventional pitched battle, Alexander led his cavalry straight to Darius's position behind. Although the Macedonian infantry came under heavy fire, continued his charge towards Darius. As the Macedonian cavalrymen cut their way through his bodyguard, Darius panicked and fled from the field, as Alexander had anticipated. The sight of the king with the Persian infantry and cavalry fleeing enemies, although Darius had escaped, captured a substantial number of the royal enmity towards his royal captives and promised to protect neutralize the Persian fleet anchored at the port city of Tyre. The city was located on an island around half a mile offshore, and naturally, Alexander did the construction of a causeway to enable his men to attack from land. The Tyrians managed to hold out for 6 months until the 332 BC. Alexander eventually captured the city by attacking on both land and sea, Alexandrian coast, and captured Gaza after a brutal 2-month siege. His next target was Egypt, then Persian Empire, governed by the satrap, had ruled Egypt for almost 2 centuries. Persian rule remained unpopular, and Mazakas knew he could not resist, and duly surrendered to Alexander at the ancient battle of Memphis. Staples, and although he was not formally crowned pharaoh, he made sacrifices to Egyptian gods and assumed the titles and responsibilities associated with kingship. It was determined to make a visit to the oracle of Amun-Ra between and Pantheon. The Greeks associated him with the Siwa oasis. The party took a circuitous route via the Nile Delta and the northern coast of Egypt, where a city named Alexandria. After marching west, the vicinity of what is now El Alamein, they turned south and made for the oracle. After consulting the priest, he was the son of Zeus Ammon. All of this, Ptolemy's first experience to rule. While Alexander was in Egypt, the king of Persia had raised another large army to confront the Macedonian conqueror. When the two armies met at the Battle of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq on the 1st of October 331 BC, Alexander was once again heavily and employed similar tactics. On this occasion, he ordered his right Persian line, which Alexander immediately exploited, leading his cavalry towards Darius. As the Persian king turned to flee once again, Alexander and his horsemen set off in pursuit, but soon returned to the battlefield. By the time Alexander returned, the crisis was over as Musaeus' men realized their king had abandoned them once again, giving Parmenion the opportunity to counterattack. Following his victory at Gaugamela, Alexander marched south to occupy Babylon, where he decided to maintain the satrapy system and confirmed Musaeus in his office. He then proceeded southeast towards the Persian heartland of Persis, taking possession of the royal capital of Susa in December. Alexander's next target was the city of Persepolis, as Darius attempted to raise a third army. Ariobarzanes, satrap of Persia, defended a pass over the Ross Mountains, known as the Persian Gates. Confined to a narrow defile, Alexander's men were cut down by the defending Persians. Alexander's progress was stalled for a month, until a local shepherd informed him of a mountain path to circumvent Ariobarzanes to attack the enemy in the center of the pass, while the king marched his men behind Ariobarzanes. However, Arian suggests that Ptolemy was deployed further in the rear. Persians raping. By late January 330 BC, Alexander's army arrived in Persepolis. Alexander sacked. According to one account, the destruction of Persepolis was encouraged by an Athenian woman in the Macedonian entourage named of Ptolemy's wives. After 3 months in Persepolis, Alexander continued the chase for Darius, now seeking to raise a new army in Central Asia. Darius's string of military failure encouraged a rebellion by his commander Bessus and the King of Kings, claiming himself as King Artaxerxes. Cautious of irritating local sentiment, when he arrived in Central Asia, Alexander ordered Darius's body to be buried in Persepolis with full ceremonial honors. As Alexander prepared to take on Bessus, he was himself a friend named Dymnus. Although the plot had been known of to Philotas, Parmenion's son and commander of the Campanian cavalry, he did not inform Alexander about it. Once Alexander learned of it, he eliminated the conspirators' reason. Alexander's primary motivation for eliminating the pair was probably because they had criticized the king for his growing adherence to Persian customs over Greek ones. Alexander responded by promoting trusted senior positions. His closest companion, Hephaestion, commanders of the Campanian cavalry, while Ptolemy in his Ptolemy had played a role in the commanding of the Mathematics derived from these histories. Furthermore, even where they do mention Ptolemy, it's debatable how much we can would have been key in later years to stress his own seniority. The Macedonian leadership in 330 BC to Kush in the winter of 330 BC and 329 BC, forcing Bessus to retreat to Sogdiana in what is now Uzbekistan, taking the city of across the Oxus River. Now Bessus managed to destroy the boats on the river. The latter issued a message to the remaining Persian in friendship with anyone who could bring Bessus to him as a captive. Two Sogdian chieftains named Spithemenes and Venice Julian formed Alexander. Despite surrendering to Alexander and began waging a guerrilla war in the mountains of Central Asia, Alexander responded with a brutal pass, of which he appointed Ptolemy as commander of one of the detachments which worked to restore order in the region. In the meantime, Alexander continued to be criticized by his companions for his embrace of Eastern customs and his insistence on remaining in Asia. Many to return home. They had marched east to conquer the Persian Empire, but now, having done so, their king seemed to be intent on wandering even further east to lands few Greeks or Macedonians had ever heard of, let alone visited. The growing resentment boiled over in the summer of 328 BC, when Alexander's old friend Clytus, who had saved his life at the Battle of the Granite River, targeted at Alexander. Ptolemy intervened and dragged the latter out of the room. But as the king continued to shout his curses, Clytus broke away from Ptolemy and ran back to continue the argument with Alexander. Then he sends to an end Central Asia. Alexander's men performed an extraordinary feat in capturing the fortress known as the Sogdian Rock by scaling up a sheer cliff face under the cover of night, protected, responsible for the night operations which enabled Alexander to deploy his siege machines. In the spring of 327 BC, Alexander married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman. The decision caused further dissension among some of Alexander's friends, who wanted him to marry a Greek woman. Ptolemy seems to have acted as intelligencer for Alexander during this period, bringing information to the king about potential plots against him. Despite the unrest, Alexander was determined to march further east to India. This formidable resistance from the Aspasian peoples. During the next phase of the campaign, Ptolemy led Alexander's left flank at the siege of Rhegium, while Leonatus, another of Alexander, commanded the Macedonian right. In total, Alexander and Leonatus swiftly overcame enemy resistance, but he himself faced a tough challenge. During the final stage of his march towards the Indus Valley, he played a prominent role in the final siege of the campaign against the mountaintop fortress of Aeolus. He was stationed at a summit on the opposite. Alexander bridged it in order to take the position. But he moved on towards Caspi's River to battle with Porus, a neighboring Indian prince who Alexander's rule. He accompanied Alexander as he led a detachment on a flank attack, but the movement was poorly executed, and Alexander found himself facing the entire enemy army. Thus, he won a decisive victory, captured Porus, and made him his. Although Alexander continued to push east, his men were no longer willing to follow him, and he was finally persuaded to turn back. Alexander wanted to reach the Indian Ocean and build in the Hydaspes. But after the fleet was damaged in a storm, but with ladders beneath them. During this engagement, the king was struck by an arrow in his neck and was shielded by an officer named Eugastus, while the rest of the army stormed the gates and massacred the garrison. Before they could inflict damage, Ariane Not long after this, Alexander, Ptolemy, and the other Macedonians turned back westwards for Persia. At Susa, in the early spring of 324 BC, married two Persian princesses, while Ptolemy married Artacama, the Persian nobleman named Artabazus, Ptolemy's wife, and may have quickly divorced her after Alexander's death. Matters deteriorated further thereafter. In the summer of 324 BC, after the king had dismissed his army and allowed them to return home as they had hoped, even heavier drinking than he was already used to. Alexander appointed Perdiccas as his new second in command and sent him to convey Hephaestion's body to Babylon, where a grand funeral ceremony was held. In 323 BC, Alexander Babylon and prepared to sea. He suddenly fell and died in mid-June. A few weeks' birth excluded him from the succession. Alexander's wife, Roxana, was no guarantee that the enormous empire which Alexander had built over the preceding decade could be held together during the long minority yet. The question of how to suspend Arrhidaeus, who could be expected to continue the Argead royal line, although he suffered, which meant that he would only be able to execute royal duties with the regency. Due to his position as Alexander's deputy, Perdiccas took charge affairs. And chaired a meeting of Alexander's generals and bodyguards to decide allow him to isolate rivals and eliminate them one by one. As part of this arrangement, King Santrad Ptolemy had suddenly emerged as the ruler of one of them. It was a fertile Macedonia from Mesopotamia. September 321 BC, Ptolemy executed an audacious plan to steal the king's remains at Damascus and justified his action by claiming that all wishes were to be buried at the oracle of Zeus Ammon in the Siwa oasis, which the king visited while in the nation of Egypt in mid-20 BC. In the name of the two kings, his entourage, although crossing the Egyptian frontier. Perdiccas made his way towards Memphis and attacked the fort of the Camels, but Ptolemy proved equal to the task and of its walls and marched directly struggled to swim across the Nile, and many drowned in their heavy armor. And to withdraw, those noticed the plight of their drownings and took off their eye. Many of them were allegedly eaten by us. With his army, was soon stabbed to death by two of his subordinates, Alexander, which Philip III to confer his status as satrap of Egypt. Ptolemy was offered the regency, but refused and remained in Egypt with Alexander's body, while the two kings departed for Macedonia. Alexander's surviving successors met at Japaradessus in Syria in 320 BC. Work out an arrangement. Alexander IV was still an infant, and Philip III was Perdiccas' assassin, Seleucus, was dead by marrying his daughter. 3 years later, Ptolemy would also marry niece, Berenice, as he firmly adopted the belief. He seems to have had at least 4 wives. The following year, the elderly Antipater died. His son would eventually emerge as his successor as regent in Greece and Macedon, who was Alexander the Great's mother. He also placed the infant king under the fourth and Roxana under house arrest, while publicly presenting companions of Alexander and other figures like who had not really known Macedonian king, but who were now emerging as powerful figures in the civil war. Dispensed with the pretenders' empire as custodians of it, were clearly all trying to acquire their own slice of the empire to themselves. Which began that Antigonus planned to become sole ruler of Alexander's and was planning an invasion of Egypt. Lysimachus, satrap of Thrace, in 315 BC, and demanded that since stated in Mesopotamia at this time more than Egypt, was attempted to use diplomatic means to undermine Ptolemy's allies in Cyprus. In 3 BC, an Egyptian fleet led by Seleucus defeated Solomon Island. In late 312 BC, Ptolemy fought a battle against Antigonus's forces near Gaza, during which Ptolemy effectively neutralized the enemy. The joint force retreated back to Egypt. By 311 BC, Gadana BC, both distinguished. The Diadochi, like would have no free to give up the pretense that they were merely ruling their territories as satraps that would one day have power to Alexander IV when he came of age. With this, we can consider that Ptolemy had emerged fully as King Ptolemy I of Egypt. Everyone understood that the sand, after his further designs, because were primarily focused on defense and trade. Alexander's body to Alexandria, Ptolemy built the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy would also be great at order building of dozens of cities called Alexandria while he was undertaking his campaigns. Alexandria he founded in northern Egypt would grow to become preeminent of beach while he would build Alexandria into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Ptolemy's ambitions extended far beyond Egypt. After a period of consolidation, solidified his control over Egypt and Cyrenaica and strengthened his armies. He resumed hostilities in the wars against Antigonus, though mixed success. The following year, in 9 BC, he led an army to occupy the western coast of Asia Minor. And the following year, he was challenging Cassander in Greece, seeking not a time. Ptolemy circulated a document as well, which stated that his full sister Cleopatra should marry Ptolemy. Cleopatra accepted the proposal, but was soon put to death by Antigonus before she could do so. It has been speculated that it was that Ptolemy came up with the idea of claiming that he Ptolemy found little support with the Greeks and returned to Egypt, though he remained in control of the key city of Corinth and had split the eastern Mediterranean and all over territories like the Rhodes and Cyprus. The latter, which Ptolemy had established control of in the Wars of the Diadochi, Demetrius to try 307 BC. To attack Cyprus. The expedition proved successful, and Ptolemy temporarily crashed from his 50,000 men under the joint command of Antigonus. A combination of poor weather and Ptolemy's tactic of encouraging enemy troops to defect by offering them bribes. It is possible that it was at this time Ptolemy began formally using the epithet of Soter that he had acquired years ago, though it is more likely that Ptolemy began using this name officially 304 BC. Demetrius strengthened his position at the expense of Cassander. Ptolemy renewed their alliance with Cassander, forced to recall his son Greece, while to recaptured Syria and Phoenicia. In 301 BC, the victory against Antigonus Demetrius at the Phrygian town of Ipsus, in which Antigonus was king. Ptolemy, by then, were the only three survivors among Alexander's original successors, amongst whom Seleucus had only ever had a tenuous link to the dead king, proceeded to divide Antigonus among themselves. Seleucus received the western half of Asia. Seleucus took over the remainder of Antigonus's territory, extending all the way to Central. This King Perseverus to Alexandria as such for his good behavior. Ptolemy and Demetrius were soon at war again following developments in Greece, where Cassander had died in 297 BC. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Philip IV. few months before his own. Antipater the fifth bring Pyrrhus to his throne at Epirus, located in what is Macedonia to the west, enabling Pyrrhus to end up embroiching as king there in 294 BC. By this time, the interment stage named large armies for and new concerns in the west, whereas of Epirus would soon be drawn to defend the Greeks of southern Italy against an emerging power there, the Roman Republic. For his part, Ptolemy took advantage of Demetrius in Macedonia by retaking control of the eastern Mediterranean. He captured Cyprus, which would thereafter remain a Ptolemaic by establishing their own cult of Ptolemy Soter. And at the same time, he seized the cities of Sidon and Tyre in the Levant, as well as parts of Asia Minor. Loyal to Demetrius. West. 287 BC. Ptolemy and Pyrrhus support and expelled Demetrius from Greece. Demetrius crossed into Asia Minor and seized a few towns, but was eventually defeated in 85 BC. He sought refuge with Seleucus, but was imprisoned by him and died in captivity in 283 BC. Thus, the wars of the Diadochi came to an end in the late 280s BC, with Ptolemy having carved out a position as king of Egypt, who also controlled Cyrenaica in Libya, the island of Cyprus, the Sinai Peninsula, large parts of the Levant, and some of the other islands of the Aegean Sea. The other two great successor states were the dominion of Seleucus, which became known as the Seleucid Empire and covered Syria, Mesopotamia, some of Persia, and Asia Minor, while the kingdom of Macedon would survive as the weaker of the major successor states. Many parts of Alexander's fleet became independent instead of the mainland. By the time the wars of Ptolemy was around 80 years old and in declining health, he had spent much of his career following Alexander's population, while he moved his capital to Alexandria and founded Ptolemais to extend Ali. He recognized that he had to respect and make sacrifices to the Egyptian gods. He developed in particular, symptomatic of his entire method of ruling. Ptolemy established a dual Hellenistic kingdom, where Greeks and Macedons intermingled with Egyptians. The Greeks were quite elite, but as the architecture of the Ptolemaic, they adapted to local conditions. As a result, we find many friezes on temple walls, statues and death marks which depict Ptolemy's the traditional guise of the Egyptian pharaohs. Nevertheless, Greek was the language of state administration. Greek and Macedonian officials held the most important offices, and during his wars, Ptolemy tended to favor Macedonian native Egyptian soldiers. Home to large populations of Greeks, Jews, Egyptians, and other groups from Asia, Europe, and Africa. There is a debate as to whether Ptolemy founded the Museum and Library of Alexandria, or if this was his son and successor Ptolemy II, born around 309 BC to Ptolemy and his wife Berenice. The library, which was part of the Museion, a complex of religious and civic buildings, attracted scholars from all over the world, was probably laid down by Ptolemy I. Research. He made an exception for the mathematician Euclid, who wrote his seminal Ellis in the field of geometry and mathematics while living in Alexandria, around 300 BC, his patronage. Construction of the library remained under Ptolemy's reign, and it was up to his son Ptolemy II to supervise its completion and organize the institution as the repository of all scholarship in the known world. Ptolemy I was also responsible for the construction of the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world. The structure stood at over 110 meters tall, the tallest man-made structure in the world at the time, with the exception of the pyramids of Giza. Equipped with a reflective mirror at daytime and a burning up to 40 miles away, and made to serve as a warning for approaching enemy ships. While Ptolemy was responsible for the design and construction work may have started in 297 BC. Was death and completed by his successor. Ptolemy was around 84 years old when he died, but as he had 2 different dating systems for his rule, it is unclear whether he died in 23 BC or 282 BC. He was succeeded by his son Ptolemaeus, then early 20s. Berenice was Ptolemy's wife. Ptolemy the Sparta's joined her in 285 BC, not long after his elder half-brother Ptolemy Coronis, the son of Eudoxus, as Ptolemy I's preferred successor. At the time Ptolemy I was at its greatest extent, but the wars of was not yet. Circa 281 BC. At the end of the wars of the successors, more than 40 kingdom's relationship with the now all-powerful Roman Republic. Demise in 30 BC, following the civil war between Mark and Octavian, Caesar's successor, in the birth of the Roman Empire. Thus, the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Ptolemy founded, was bookended by the short-lived empire of Alexander the Great. Birth of the Roman Empire. Ended his lecture in an important player at court and a trusted friend of Alexander the Great. While he served as Alexander's bodyguard and saw action in most of his battles, it is debatable how senior his position was during Alexander. You may exaggerate how close he was to the king in later, and is by writer Arrian, who used his own histories when writing their accounts of the conquests of the Ptolemy came to the fore following Alexander's death. Firstly, by proposing the division, aiming for him or its claims, and give trade fighters like Demetrius and Seleucus for several decades. He established control of the key islands of Cyprus and Rhodes, but was unable to fulfill his ambitions of becoming king of his native Macedon. However, beyond the failure of any one individual such as Ptolemy to win the wars of the Diadochi, Ptolemy's work laid the foundations of most in the ancient Mediterranean, and a city which, even after rituals of the Eastern Mediterranean. What do you think of Ptolemy the First? Effective military and political leader to success in the legitimate successor to all of the empire of Alexander the Great. Please let us know in the comment for watching. was born at some unknown date and year, 67, the year of his birth. King Amenhotep III, for much of his life, as we will see, was a took himself later in his life. Amenhotep had been on the throne for around 2 decades. Time Akhenaten was born, having come to be pharaoh in the early 1380 BC. It is not known where Akhenaten is in the middle of the Egyptian kingdom in the 14th century BC. Approximate to modern-day Luxor, major royal palace had been constructed at Malkata by his father, and it would probably make most sense for him to have been born there. Akhenaten's mother was Tia, the great wife of Amenhotep. Numerous wives, often being close relative, even sisters, there was great wife, and a successor would normally chosen from amongst the sons born to this chief consort. Akhenaten in line to throne, but he had an older brother who was also born to Dia, Prince Thutmose. Beyond these, Akhenaten had a very large number of siblings and half-siblings. The boy who would become Akhenaten one day was born into a part of the world which already had a very long history. By the 14th century BC, Egypt had emerged as far back as the 4th millennium BC. As one of the major centers of Neolithic and Chalcolithic century, the Nile flooded every year. This annual inundation deposited rich alluvial soil onto the banks of the river, several hundred meters inland, allowing people here to survive out of the agricultural products grown on these floodplains in the desert environment. Based on this, advanced culture with the economic elements emerged, and by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the pharaohs peaked early in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. As the rulers of what is termed the Old Kingdom built the greatest of the period of a century harassed by the Hyksos. Time, great-grandfather's rise to a unified Egypt, Nile, trade flourished across the eastern Mediterranean, and an ambitious building program was initiated. This period of immense Egyptian power, which Thutmose, the greatest ruler of, is called the period of Egyptian history. Akhenaten would benefit from succeeding to the throne. position of power, a period of turmoil. We detail out Akhenaten's earnest in the reign of one of the most unusual and significant of ancient Egypt theories have emerged over the years. One holds that he was raised to a significant extent away from the royal capital at Memphis in the north, near where Cairo stands today. Here it is posited that a priest of the god Ptah, the god of workers and industry in Egypt, is that Akhenaten succeeded him in that role. Akhenaten, with strong religious sensibilities, concern his education. As possible tutors of the prince did indeed tutor young Akhenaten in his childhood years, as they with a major tomb. His role in educating the pharaoh. Parinitha would also go on to Akhenaten's life and reign. Some greater clarity is possible when it comes to Akhenaten's wives and children. Though there is still a lot that remains speculative even in this area, one thing is for sure: his great wife or chief wife was a woman by the name. They were married at some stage in the 1350s. Little more than most likely wed villages. They may have been closely related, with some Egyptologists would become one of the most notorious of all ancient Egypt's pharaohs. Secondly, she is famous for a remarkable bust or statue of her head neck that has survived over 3 millennia. This painted limestone bust was created around 1345 BC by a famous royal He was a princess of the Mitanni royal, a people who ruled out the day. Iraq, Mead, Turkey, Syria. Her marriage to Akhenaten would have been political. Akhenaten's reign, Argugia and Tadukiba were two different wives of 5, as she, unlike Nefertiti, also possibly married Ptah, while there is speculation that he was married to an Hittite sister of his. From many children, his aunt marriage to Nefertiti resulted in 7 or more. Most of them daughters. there were children from his other unions. In the key elements of government and the religious obligations of the pharaoh, there would also have been a growing awareness of the fact that perhaps did not have long left of statues, other visible depictions of the pharaoh dating 1350s, being aged and sick. While DNA had unpopular views that the Egyptians had very effective forms of dental care, Amenhotep was also suffering by the time Akhenaten became co-ruler from teeth that were plagued with cavities and which would have caused him serious pain. It was this obese, critic and pain-rich to rule until around 1351 BC. Though perhaps as late as 1349 death, Akhenaten ascended as pharaoh in his own right. In his personal fortune, down to 1346 BC, have been termed the to indicate that he was still continuing to rule in a regular fashion from the seat of government near the temple of Karnak in the capital of Thebes, on the course of the river Nile in central Egypt, likely crowned here. Though possibly at Memphis, the ancient capital, there are also material evidence in the early 1340s which point towards Akhenaten continuing to worship modern Egyptian gods such as Ra, Amun, Hathor, and Nekh, while textual that in plural. He also continued to develop the city of Thebes, a metropolis which was at the heart of a rich and energetic kingdom, a later period of immense vitality and wealth of a kind, which would not be seen again until the Greek culture of the 6th and BC. Thebes was at the very heart of this, above areas like stone cutting, painting, pottery making, and other crafts, as well as professional. Furthermore, the possible last few years of Akhenaten's reign would have appeared perfectly normal. Few could have predicted what a strange turn things were about. Year was Akhenaten's completion that had initiated during his long reign of some 4 decades. This focused on mortuary site, which Amenhotep had developed at Khor el Hedin across the Nile River from the city of Thebes. The majority would have consisted of roads dark along the walkways. This was a standard practice of ancient Egyptian religious buildings. And if rituals were held here at specific times, penetrating through specific the building would have made a deep impression on participants in it, particularly where old objects were used to refract the sun's rays in different ways. It all points to the way the sun was already central to the Egyptian religious system, and provides a backdrop to the religious changes Akhenaten was about to undertake. Elsewhere in the building, antique statues were erected, known today as the Colossi of Memnon. These 60-foot-high stone monuments loomed at the river and pressed people voyaging up and down the river on boats. And work on the temple and the carving of the Colossi was also completed around 1350 BC, most likely just after Akhenaten had become pharaoh in his own right, and he would have overseen the ritual which no doubt accompanied the solemnizing of the new temple structure in other respects. He continued to add to the temple within the city precinct on the right bank of the Nile in Thebes. Here there is even an inscription depicting the new pharaoh making offerings to the god Ra, though elsewhere there was a subtle profusion of shrines dedicated to the sun god Aten in the early 1340s. Elsewhere in Thebes, Akhenaten oversaw a festival in the second or third year of his reign. After 20 or 30 years of the same ruler of the kingdom, and then every fresh willingness to break with tradition. His motive in doing so may have been a desire to establish continuity between his own reign and that of his father, and it is noted that the 40th anniversary of Amenhotep III's accession. If this is so, perhaps Akhenaten felt some vulnerability about having been a younger son and only emerging as the heir, and then the said festival may have been organized in an effort to bring the legitimacy of his reign status as the although while a normative element to Akhenaten's reign during its first years, it would soon take a dramatic turn that has created an infamous position for the pharaoh within the history of ancient Egypt. See, though for how long Akhenaten had been considering this new course, or why he decided upon it at this time, remains a mystery, with no clear answer. This all centered on the deity Aten, Atonu, or his other references to him on its earliest incarnation. The name Aten was used simply as a noun to refer to the spherical or disc-like appearance of the sun when viewed in the sky. Over time, the term Aten became one which was used to refer to a sun deity or god. Such sun god, the most popular the most important of all goddesses, while in the one of over a dozen deities which emerged around the world of the sun, day and night in Egypt over the centuries.